Come on, young Benjamin, I'll show you the special tree today. It's here in the garden. Well, everyone calls it a garden, but it's an olive grove, as you well know. It's always been here on this enclosed rocky hillock by the side of the road on the edge of the Kidron Valley. And of course, it's studded with trees, gnarled old olive trees. Your great-grandfather said they were old when he was a boy. He should know, he's been tending them since he was a boy. In truth, of course, they don't actually need much tending. The roots need a bit of care and attention now and again. You have to know how to plant and prune the suckers properly. Oh, and of course there is an art in the harvesting of the fruit and of the pressing of the olives to ensure a good quality olive oil. There's a huge old press over in the grove, actually. That's why it's called Gethsemane. It means seed press. Now, of course, when you say all of that all at once, there does seem like quite a lot of work in our old family's olive grove, but it never seemed like work to me. I loved this place ever since I first saw it. And I remember that day like it was yesterday. Your granddad brought me here. Our families were meeting to discuss our betrothal. They'd got to the complicated stuff about how many goats and sheep should change hands, and we were getting restless, and so they told us to come out into the garden, and well, we did. Your granddad Jochen, he brought me here just to see the trees, and I remember him saying that if I was to become his wife, I would have to learn to climb trees just as well as he could. I must have been about 10 years old. He would have been a bit older. He was just starting his apprenticeship. Even so, he absolutely loved this place, even then. Especially at night, he said, which sounded strange to me at that point. He told me he liked to sit up in the middle of the oldest tree in the olive grove. This one, the one we call Grandaddy. He told me the family legend that it was the oil from old Grandaddy's olives that kept the Hanukkah lamp burning for 8 days during the Maccabees' revolt. But that's not why he sat in it. Its trunk forms a perfect seat, as you can see. Almost a hammock, really. He would sit up there and watch the lights of the city across the valley, or look up through the branches and gaze at the stars. He told me that on still, clear evenings, he could even hear snatches of conversation from the soldiers patrolling the city walls over the Kidron Valley. Most of the time, though, he could just hear the breeze rustling the leaves in the branches. He made it sound so magical. Even the time that he stayed there all night because he fell asleep in the branch. Anyway, he persuaded me to have a go. Of course, I had no idea what to do. It was slow progress, but I made it. And I eventually got to the place, and I found out it really was as comfy as he said. But I was exhausted by then. My arms hurt, my back ached, so I just laid my head against the bark and listened to the sounds of the leaves, the sounds of the trees. And then we heard something else. Voices. people. Jochen whispered to me. He knew who it was coming into the garden. I could hear their voices, even though they tried to speak quietly. Simon the fisherman found it difficult to do anything quietly. And we knew all the disciples quite well, even Jesus. They often met here to pray, and Jesus sometimes came on his own. It wasn't just Jochen and his family that loved this old olive grove. So, Jochen wasn't at all alarmed when he heard them coming in. Pretty soon we saw them too, through the branches of old Grandaddy. But none of the disciples knew that we were here, in the tree, in the garden that night. Jesus left some of the disciples near the entrance and came further into the garden with just 3 of them. I couldn't make out who it was at first. Then I recognised the bulky frame of Simon, the one Jesus called Peter. They were coming towards our tree. Then I heard Jesus say, "Pray with me here." And before we could move, Peter, James and John, I could see them all clearly by now, had slumped at the base of our tree, leaning up against the trunk, and we were trapped up in the branches. Jesus didn't move very far off. He was certainly still under the canopy of old Grandaddy as he began to pray. I couldn't make out his words at first. In truth, I didn't want to. It already felt like I was intruding on a private conversation. Eventually, though, I heard him clearly say, "If it be your will, Father, take this cup of bitterness from me." I looked at Jochen then. He looked at the disciples, leaning against the trunk of our tree. They were fast asleep. I shook my head at that and looked over towards the entrance to see if the others were still there, just as Jesus said out loud, "Nonetheless, not my will, but yours be done." And just then I caught sight of the torches weaving over the bridge across the Kidron, heading straight for us at Gethsemane. I just knew, without knowing why, something evil was coming, not good. I called out then. I couldn't help myself. Jochen put his hand over my mouth, but my loud cry had startled the disciples. Jesus returned to them and spoke urgently to them. They got up, and as they all moved off, Jesus turned his head and looked directly at me up in the tree. He knew we'd been there all the time. He smiled directly at me, a quick, reassuring smile, before he moved off. But it felt like such a long moment to me, one I have never forgotten. Jochen managed to help me down out of the tree, and we followed the way the disciples went, moving cautiously between the trees as it was almost dark now. By the time we arrived at the entrance, all was confusion, and Jesus was being held, pinned by the arms really, held fast by 2 temple guards, while, unbelievably, one of his disciples embraced him in the middle of that troop of soldiers. It was Judas. All the other disciples had fled. I thought at first Judas was being brave and standing by his master. Ironic, isn't it? He wasn't being brave, he was betraying Jesus. And Jesus was letting him. Before we could summon up the wit or the courage, they'd gone, hustled out of the garden, and we were left alone in the ancient, quiet place, knowing that we had witnessed the ultimate betrayal. Now, young Benjamin, there's something about this story which has always troubled me, something which has taken me a long time to work out. I'm an old woman now, but those events I witnessed as a young girl have stayed with me for such a long time. But a question has always come into my mind whenever I remember that day. Why didn't he run? If I, a naive little girl, could sense the evil intent of those torch-bearing soldiers, surely Jesus could. He could easily have slipped out of the garden before they arrived, or at least when they came in. The grove is full of shadows and movement just from the trees. Even with their torches, they wouldn't have found him. They didn't find us two. They didn't find any of the disciples, and none of them was the sharpest tool in the box. So, why didn't he run? I have asked myself that question for years. And the answer finally dawned on me, only very recently in my old age. Jesus didn't run, because in the end there would have been nowhere for him to go. Either that day or some other, he had to face up to the evil that we humans do. Sooner or later, evil must be defeated by goodness, hatred by love, death by life. Jesus took on evil at a time of his choosing, God's choosing if you like, and proved that goodness is stronger than evil, that love is stronger than hate, that light is stronger than darkness, life is stronger than death. And he began to prove that to me and to everyone, right here in the olive grove that day. Now it stands a mute witness to the betrayal which released such a power of love into this world. Now, young Benjamin, you're very welcome to come into the grove whenever you like. Visit whenever you like. But if you want to climb up in old Grandaddy, remember, it's a very special tree. This is a very special place. One of very special memories.